All right, so we're here with Auron MacIntyre. He hosts a YouTube channel, which is quite interesting. He does a lot of short pieces on the media and power analyses and things of that sort. One of the interesting things about Auron is that he actually worked in journalism for a bit, and he has a kind of a different perspective than other right wing thinkers or pundits that you talk to, because most people who are in the right haven't actually had any experience within like the media or so-called left institutions. So I want to talk to him about how his trajectory went from maybe a more normal conservative perspective to a more dissident right-wing perspective, and I'm going to give him the floor.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Just, I guess, a little bit of background. Yeah, I am someone who came from a very, I guess you would say in America, a very traditional conservative background. Politics weren't big in my house, but we were certainly more of the conservative bent. And as I grew up and got more interested in politics, I definitely fell along those kind of GOP right-wing lines that you'd expect from that background. So I got involved in politics. I worked in Republican politics for a while, ended up landing in journalism. That wasn't my intention. I don't have a J school degree, but I ended up becoming a reporter for a few years with on the political and crime beat. Nothing huge, but mainly local reporting. I was a staff reporter on a couple different newspapers in my area. And I guess how I got my political journey, like I said, I started in that very talk radio, GOP, conservative mindset. But as I looked at what was happening in the country, especially I think post 2016, I think that's when a lot of people said, okay, no matter what side you're on, something is not working correctly. And as I looked at the landscape around there, I was saying, okay, the traditional GOP explanation for our political and cultural reality does not make sense. And so I need to start looking outside of that. And that led me to, not only look at things from different right-wing perspectives, but also to maybe be more open to criticisms of liberalism in general, not just in the American liberal Democrat progressive sense, but liberalism as an idea, both classical that we usually think now of as the right wing liberalism and progressive liberalism on the left. And so I think that's kind of now put me in the position where I'm at right now, where I guess you could call it the dissident right sphere is kind of where a lot of people who are no longer on the libertarian / right wing GOP establishment spectrum have been kind of thinking about where we should go and what we should do next, onboarding some of those criticisms, not just of progressivism, but also of the more traditional GOP notions of kind of politics and political alignment.
Yeah, so I think I had a similar trajectory to you, but I was actually, definitely one of the more, moderate, people. I was just like, I didn't even vote for Obama. I never voted for Obama, neither time. Because I just didn't. I knew about politics. I had it as a side hobby, but I never really considered it to be like that important. Obama versus Romney. Looking back on it, it really wasn't that stark of a choice. You know what I mean? And so, with the rise of Trump, what I saw was a kind of manifestation of many different things coalescing together. On the one hand, you had the rise in populism, which was, evident from him and Sanders in that primary. And so that was tied to a kind of, economic anxiety, economic stagnation, the kind of the immiseration of the working class, the deindustrialization of the Midwest and that stuff. And on the other hand, you had this resurgent nationalism, this kind of like, muscular, Americanism, the American flag was prominent, this idea of, getting tight with the borders and all of that. And so once I saw that entering into the mainstream of politics, it really, made me like, try to understand, politics from a perspective that was outside of the mainstream media. So I was one of those guys that was shocked that Trump won, because I was a guy who read the Atlanta, you know what I mean? So I was like a pretty, moderate, basically, if you don't actually like seek out an extreme in politics, you end up and you actually become politically educated. You kind of just take this like normie center left or center right neoliberal or neoconservative perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I had that kind of perspective. And so from the perspective of an institutionalist, Trump winning was absolute nonsense, right? He broke every norm. He was gauche. He was tacky. He didn't really have any like policy mastery. This was like a complete upheaval of everything we had thought was possible. Like a guy like Bob, like a guy like in the Democratic primary a few years ago, Howard Dean, he got destroyed for like saying "ye" or whatever in a stream.
Yeah.
So if a guy could get destroyed for that, a guy coming down the escalator talking about some Mexicans being rapists and murderers, there's no way he could win, right? That was the perspective I had, and Trump kind of completely shattered, my perspective of like, all right, how are we really supposed to look at politics, going forward if somebody like this could win and these ideas could gain traction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was what shook a lot of people. While I certainly preferred Trump to Hillary, at that time he certainly wasn't my first choice. And again, at this point I was operating very much by the classic GOP playbook. That was very much what I thought, Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz would have been the choice. That was very much my mentality at that time. But I did not expect Trump to win. I had looked at all the polls. I was just starting to work in media. And so this was very much the understanding that I had of the situation. And so, yeah, exactly the same thing. When I saw what happened, I was like, okay, the explanations that have been offered to me do not make sense. And if this model has failed completely to explain reality, I need to be in search of a different model, because clearly a lot of people are just trying to explain to me this is some kind of outlier, or I don't know, Russia rigged the election, and just none of that makes sense. Like, if you want to be a serious human being, you need to understand the forces at play and how these things came about. And so that's what got me thinking outside of my traditional conservative bubble and my traditional, mainstream understanding of political reality. What explains how we got here? What explains these forces I'm seeing? Because it can't possibly just be like, because of course we know what populism means, right? Populism is democracy we don't like, right? Like, that's what populism actually means. When someone says someone is populist, what they mean is the people like them and I don't like what the people are saying. And so the question is, why was the media so invested in telling the people on both sides, Republican and Democrat, that they were choosing wrong? Why is it so important for every institution in the United States and the wider and Western world to tell the populace to stop thinking the way it was thinking, both left and right? I found that very interesting.
Yeah, and you're right, because I think a part of it, and this is where we can move a little bit into some of the more analytical stuff. But I think there are a few competing reasons given for that. So you got, on the one hand, there are those who say the reason that they were kind of against this populist upheaval was really a class reaction. Right? So they saw the possibility ever since around since 1970, the groundwork was laid for a kind of class takeover in the United States. Michael Lynn talks about the overclass. Burnham talked about it a little bit before when he talks about the managerial elite.
Absolutely.
And so what happened was there was kind of a class reaction to some of the labor left reforms that had happened during, the New Deal era and a little bit after. And after, because there was a time period where they were going to try to, a time of remaking the United States after, the World War II. And because of the harsh pushes by labor, who had a lot more power during that time, there were some concessions given in terms of labor rights and union power. Around the 70s, a little bit before that, there was a push towards a reorienting of that consensus, right? So you had Jimmy Carter really was the first president who was supposedly, quote unquote, neoliberal. People put Reagan as the guy. Jimmy Carter actually instituted a lot of the privatizing reforms that would happen over the next few years. Reagan just, rubber stamped it, So with this class takeover that took place, that kind of revolt of the elite or finance capital, with this revolt taking place, they kind of wanted to set up a government that was based upon technocratic expertise and limiting the popular participation of the people, right? Because the people actually, don't really have, the vast majority of Americans don't really have, a high opinion of corporate domination. So with that being said, when they saw like outsider candidates like Sanders or Trump as a threat to that consensus, which manifests itself not only in terms of corporate dominance, but in terms of policy networks, policy crafting networks, in terms of the military structure, in terms of the nonprofits and NGOs, it's a fourfold division. When they saw that there was a possibility that this consensus could be threatened, they kind of closed ranks and used the power apparatus that they had to try to explain to people why the way they were voting was wrong. That's kind of the one explanation. Liberals, and I mean by this like center left, they give a more. This is where you get the white grievance stuff. So it was basically a reaction. The reason Trump won was a reaction to white grievance, the increase in minority participation, the fact that women, were getting higher education levels than men, the stagnation of wages. It was basically a ressentiment narrative, a Nietzschean narrative of they're the powerful are reacting to the loss of their power, and they're going to they're reacting to that, and they're using political means such as Trump to enforce that. And so that was one explanation for how Trump won. That comes from the left liberal. And in contrast to that, the idea that the experts are telling people to vote a certain way, that's actually a good thing. That's just protecting democracy. That's just protecting minority classes and et cetera. So you get these kind of like two at odds explanations for like how the political process and how what really motivated Trump's election and what really motivated the rise in populism.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple different people who are fond of saying that what we have is a class war that is trying to be spun as a race war, which I think is probably right. I think we have, as you're saying, a dedicated elite class that is no longer invested in the well-being of its nation, and because of that is willing to make trade-offs that clearly hurt the middle class of lower classes, and because I know there's I know because I saw the video on your channel, you've read Patrick Deneen's book, and he does a really good job in his book Why Liberalism Failed of pointing out that the two halves of liberalism were kind of broken and spread across the two major political movements in the United States. So the progressive part, the economic justice part of, or rather, I'm sorry, the progressive part, the social justice part was picked up by the progressive wing, the Democratic Party, and then the economic market-oriented part was broken apart and spread across the GOP and the Republican Party. And what this did is, for many decades, created a heads I win, tails you lose scenario for opposition to this vision, this neoliberal vision of the country, because when the GOP was in power, the only thing it pushed was the economic libertarian argument, and then when the Democratic Party was in power, all it pushed were the social policies that would fundamentally crumble things like the family that generate middle class wealth. And what happened is basically the middle class got eaten alive from both ends. And so that's kind of put us in a situation where we are. That's why we're seeing, but now by a large part, a lot of the neoconservatives moving over to the Democrats at this point. You're seeing kind of those Bush era war hawks now moving over to Biden's campaign and endorsing him. You're seeing the Lincoln Project guys. You're seeing all these people who were largely invested in the neoliberal project from the right. They're now consolidating in the left because Trump is, for better or for worse, the only visual opposition to that vision, because Bernie, at the end of the day, was always going to be blocked from power in the Democratic Party. And so the only outlet for those kind of oppositional views at this point is Trump. And so that's why I think you're seeing the consolidation now. The people who were invested in the current status quo have all moved that direction because they had to. If that makes sense. I think you may still be muted.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, there you go.
Sorry about that. So you look at guys like David Brooks, David Frum, Jennifer Rubin, all these people, Iraq War, Hawks. They're going to the Democrats. They're never Trumpers now. And one of the funny things about it is that Trump, besides, not bombing, foreign countries at an accelerated rate, policy-wise, he hasn't really distinguished himself from a traditional Republican. I mean, his only real substantial legislative accomplishments was a huge tax cut for corporations. I mean, that's the truth of the matter. So it's kind of strange that despite the fact that Trump, for the most part, has been pretty conservative in his governance. I mean, Ben Shapiro has just come out in support of Trump. That tells you everything you need to know, right? Mm-hmm. That tells you everything you need to know about where his policy in terms of governing has actually situated itself. He's actually been carrying out the same, free market economic policy, that the Republicans have been carrying out since Reagan. I mean, in fact, he's even increasing in a lot of ways because the deregulation of the government has reached a level that it hadn't reached, since Reagan. So this type of strange bedfellows that is being created, not based upon policy, but based upon the perceived threat to the institutions. That's what liberalism cares about: process, institutions, norms, this kind of cultural and procedural critique as opposed to a policy critique.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is almost entirely a cultural threat. You're absolutely right that Trump's largest political accomplishments are very standard GOP fare. In many ways, Trump is basically a blue dog Democrat, right? Like when it comes to trade and other things, he largely espouses Democrat policies from 20 years ago, but he does so in a way that threatens the cultural hegemony of liberalism. And so even though his policy threats outside of foreign policy, where I think you're right, he has made big strides in rolling back some of Americans' forward policy, imperialism. I think that outside of that, most of his domestic policy has not been significantly out of step with normal GOP or even in some ways, Democrat policy from 20 years ago. But because he clearly threatens them culturally, that's why they're reacting the way they're reacting. They know at the end of the day what Trump really stands for and what danger he really opposes, and it's not a policy position. It is threatening this general idea, as you pointed out, that everything The point is, the reason Mitt Romney never really mattered is Mitt Romney is controlled. I don't say that because I think Mitt Romney is disingenuous. I think Mitt Romney believes more or less what he says out loud. What I mean is Mitt Romney exists inside the Overton window, and he accepts all the norms and all the barriers set in front of him by liberal society. So Mitt Romney will never say or do anything that is unexpected. And anytime he has a wrong opinion, how do you change Mitt Romney's opinion? You get a professor to repeat it, and then you get a journalist to repeat it, and then you get 50 journalists to repeat it. And by the end of the week, Mitt Romney's marching in a Black Lives Matter demonstration, because that's who he is. He will always accept the framing of what is presented to him. Trump will not. Now, this makes Trump look brash, and this makes Trump look ridiculous and different things at times, because let's be frank, he is. But that is also what makes him dangerous, because he is just willing to go to places and say things that are obvious to most people, but are not discussed in polite society. And that is that is corrosive to the liberal control of the narrative, because if someone is willing to go out and discuss those things, then other people will possibly discuss them. And that means that it is harder and harder to simply box candidates and oppositions into a particular form that can continually be presented to the American people as if it's a choice. Would you like a slightly red or slightly blue version of your meat today? That's something that they've been doing for a very long time. And Trump and Bernie are both people who could challenge that, but Bernie kissed the ring and Trump didn't. And so Bernie was not allowed to move forward and Trump did. And that's why we're seeing the opposition to Trump. If Bernie was truly able to break through and truly committed and truly didn't care about the frame the way that Trump did, I think we'd see the same pushback against Bernie. But I just don't think he was able to cross that line. I don't think he was able to do it.
Well, that had a lot to do with Obama. So I don't know if you watched the video that I did on Obama, but that really is the core issue with that. And plus, the Democrats are just better. They're technocrats, so they have a better party apparatus in terms of constraining, the popular will, and also they are more receptive to mainstream media messaging. Well,
I think they largely dictate. We might disagree on that, but I think they largely dictate that messaging. I guess I should say it this way. I think that relationship is far more symbiotic than the Republican interaction with the press, and therefore, yes, I think that does end up being correct.
All right, that's a good point. So let's segue into that then. So if you look at any of these, like some of you guys' channels, the reactionary or dissident right guys, it seems like you always have this idea that the left is winning. And so this is a very interesting idea to me as somebody who was, probably, farther left than most on at least economics. So I see like the left is winning. They're getting trans, whatever thing it is, like, and they're using the media and academia as the primary outlets to which to push their agenda, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea of the cathedral is the idea, at least that's from what I gather, is a media-run state, a state that's basically run by a kind of spontaneous ordering of certain consensus-making apparatuses, such as academia, the media, the culture, sports, etc. These cultural and tastemakers kind of combine together based upon a few similar normative principles, and they create this apparatus that kind of facilitates democratic rule. Now, from that's my my basic synopsis of it. So after reading over like some of the social science on this issue, it's contested whether the media actually has that degree of influence over people's decision making. So that's one problem I have with it. And the second problem I have with it is that it doesn't really. And I read over the whole thing, over all of Mulbuck's letter, mm-hmm. And he doesn't really have a strong class analysis. And to me, like, you can't. And to me, that's a weakness in terms of understanding how power works in the United States. So without a class analysis, to me, you can't really understand how power is actually operative in the United States. And so those are some of my two big reservations about his work. So you can go ahead and explain to me more about how do you understand Moldbug and why is it that you guys think the left is on a rampage, you know?
Yeah, well, I think so for anybody who's not familiar with the terminology, Mencius Moldbug is the pen name of a guy named Curtis Yarvin, who is someone that I do a lot of videos about on my channel, and is somewhat popular in different parts of I guess kind of the YouTube dissident right sphere. And he has an idea which I think you explained pretty well, the cathedral. And the idea is that basically the reason that our culture is continuously moving in a progressive leftward direction is that most of our taste making and consensus making apparatus, our institutions that influence the way our culture works, all kind of believe in the same religion, and that religion is progressivism. And so because everybody who is a reporter goes to the same schools and they're educated by the same professors who are all talking about the same ideas and reinforcing those ideas as moral, they tend to be adopted by the elite class. And I think this is where the class analysis does come in, is that there is a elite class of those who are educated and are going to move into kind of these creative spaces, these cultural spaces, these informational spaces, and they're all informed by the same culture, the same progressive culture, and they have the same values, the same progressive values. And so when they go into these fields, it's not that there's a conspiracy of people who are getting central orders to go out and write news stories to cheer on communism or something. That's not it at all. But these people all have the same outlook on kind of how the world should work. And so when they write these stories, or they write books, or they write research papers, they always have this slight bias towards that idea. And because this material in our giant disconnected world is how most people understand the outside world, they're the only thing that they consume that tells them about the outside world tends to be this media, whether it be entertainment or informational, and these ideas from academia. And so it's constantly moving the culture to the left. It's constantly moving it in a progressive direction. Now, I think the thing that often gets maybe people on the left who are on board with breaking from the mainstream narrative, the thing that trips them up about this is they will say, well, how can you say that the left, that they're removing left? Because there's all these things, there's all these corporations that these people support, and that's not left wing. And so I think there's a couple things that you have to parse there. First, you have to parse the power analysis from then the directional analysis. So like the power analysis of the cathedral, and I think you talked about this to me, you said when we were emailing back and forth, this is nothing in itself that is new. Gramsci, I have not read Antonio Gramsci, but many people have told me, as I've been talking about Moldbug's ideas, that he talks about exactly something similar. This idea that this consensus making apparatus of elites. So this is not a new idea solely to Moldbug, and so I think separating that simple analysis and not calling it left or right is useful, because I think it's just a power analysis that's true. I think you can also see this in that a lot of Curtis Yarvin's analysis also comes from guys like Burnham. Burnham was a Trotskyite before he started moving in kind of the National Review Republican direction. And so a lot of his power analysis, like stuff from the Machiavellians and the managerial state, came while he was still either a Trotskyite or just had recently kind of, left it. And so again, I don't think this power analysis is classless, and I don't think that it is solely of the right. In fact, many times I have people tell me, you're just using, communist power analysis. You're just using Marxist power analysis from the right. And so I don't, and I'm not allergic to that idea either. I'm certainly not a communist or a socialist, but if the tool works, then I use it. And so we can probably get into why I think the left is moving undeniably. I think we are moving undeniably progressive. I think any objective look at where we're going does reveal that. But I do want to separate out the idea of the cathedral and the power analysis of kind of this decentralized taste-making apparatus from then the political direction it's predicting will move, because I think those are two separate things.
Right. So that was good. That was a good response, and it clarified some things for me. But what I'm trying to make clear here is that there is like a whole social science about this, about like, who is the ruling class in the country, like what is their ruling class, and there's elite theory, which is goes back to guys like Plato, and is being to some sense it's resurrected by this guy that wrote Ages of Discord. It's a pretty good book. It's about how overproduction of elites drives societal tension. So there's elite theory. There's like an organizational theory. There's institutional theory, and then there's class domination theory, right? So the distinction between elite theory and class domination theory is that elite theory usually poses, it usually gives an understanding of the elite that is based upon like quantitative variables. So you'll say you got the 5, the 5 or 10% who are the best at X, or the 5 or 10% who are the best at Y. And those are the elites, or the 5 or 10% who drive the most traffic on social media, etc. Class domination theory is a theory where if you look at like, okay, who is like there is a class. So in this case, if you read over a book called Who Rules America, that's one of the canonical texts on this theory. It's a really good text. You take a look over it. It talks about how there is a corporate rich who sets the agenda for like the whole, societal apparatus. So it's a top-down theory. The tastemakers are not setting the agenda. It's a corporate rich who is setting the agenda, and their interest is not primarily ideological. Their interest is primarily monetary, material. It's about their class station. So the idea that progressivism, if progressive ideas, and I do think in the culture we are moving to the left, but the left is primarily defined as an economic, understanding. That's why Marx's best work is Capital. It's primarily understood economically, and also with regard to state power. So the two pillars of the left is democratization of power by either public ownership of the means of production, sometimes workers' cooperatives, or expanding the franchise in terms of voting. Those are what the key issues that define the left in terms of power. So to me, the progressive ideology being picked up or used by the corporate rich, they'll use any ideology. It just happens to be the one that's the best to basically facilitate their class position, because it sets people at odds with each other over cultural and symbolic issues.
Sure. Yeah, I guess, of course, definitions are always tricky because they are essential and also the hardest thing to nail down. So I guess the thing is that you could define the left economically, and I think that's largely what a lot of people on the far left would like to do. And I very much understand that. But I think the idea that anything is primarily economic is hard to swallow, because I think we have tried to create primarily economic identities over the last, 150 years. And I think that's kind of what modernity is, right? It's the redefinition of humanity as an economic identity rather than a cultural or societal or any other type of identity. And so I think probably both of us are looking at that as a problem. I know I am. And our solutions to that are, I guess, different. And then maybe we want to redefine our tools as to how that gets addressed or how that gets analyzed. Because you'd say, well, the elites are the corporate power, and that's what's going to define these tastes. And I think that's true, but there's a reason that I think our elites have transitioned into corporate power. And this, of course, I don't know how deep you want to go on to this, but this can go back to the rise of mercantilism, right? Like, we can go all the way back to leaving feudalism, right? It used to be that martial prowess was basically the determinant factor in sovereignty, right? The king was the king because he could get more swords together than anyone else. Now, this, of course, accumulated him wealth, but he did not rule primarily through wealth. He ruled primarily through force. As you see the rise of a mercantile class and you see the accumulation of capital, you start to see the influence of forces outside of the kings. And this is why you see the rise of, the reduction of absolute monarchy and the increase in the powers of nobility and parliament. Is you start seeing secondary and tertiary classes start to grow in power, which means that the way that power is held is redefined. And so we could go real deep into that if we want to. I guess I shouldn't get too far down that rabbit hole. But I guess my point is, the reason I see the elites, and you pointed to the Pareto distribution, the idea that the competent will eventually accumulate power and accumulate wealth. And I think that's correct. And I think that is what creates elites, largely because our current marker of elite status is economic. I think it accumulated, martial prowess and more political power previously because that was what was our marker of status. But no matter what the hierarchy is built out of, I think you will always see elites inside it, and the elites will always control it. And I think that's a basic law and fundamental law of human nature and a political reality. And that's probably why I'm on the right as opposed to the left, is not that I think that's a great thing. I'm not looking at it as a moral case here or there. I'm simply saying it is a reality of power and societal structure. And if it's going to be with us for the end of time, I think it's better to understand it and turn it towards positive ends rather than trying to flatten it artificially, because I don't think that works. And I think we've seen that it doesn't over the long term. But that's probably enough for me on that. I kind of went all over the place.
No, that was fine. Yeah, so I'm not. So there is controversy about this stuff in terms of, like, on the left about what how we should understand elites and elite theory and what have you. I do think that there's a tendency for power to solidify among a certain group, a smaller group or a smaller segment of a society, based upon multiple reasons. The idea is not to eliminate completely, the hierarchies. It's to chasten them, right? It's to make them as responsible as they can be to democratic and popular, intervention. So, Lenin, some liberal wrote to Lenin, like, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not a Marxist, though I am on the far left economically. He wrote to Lenin, he's like, well, everybody, we're not going to be able to make everybody the same. And Lenin's like, nobody says that we're going to make everybody the same. That's not the point. The point is not like artificial, forced equality that cannot possibly happen. That's nonsensical. So that's not the idea. The idea is to make a society in which we don't have elites with a domineering role in it. So, like, I mean, there's going to be elites. There's going to be a stratification, but I mean, we don't want it to be a complete, domination. Of course, classical Marxism would say that the idea is the class of society, or a society that isn't based upon these type of stratifications. And, you know, that might even be possible too, depending upon how far technology advances and how far politics can be dissolved into pure, you know, technocracy. But that has its own risk. But I think that's one of the differences. One of the other things is, I think that when I'm talking about like the corporate elite and corporate power and this things, if you look over other nations, the corporate rich don't have as much influence as they do in America. So, you know, it has to be taken case by case. In America, the corporate rich are the dominant class, right? And that's partly has to do with, you know, the fact that finance capital is at its strongest here, and it really took off here, some of the neoliberal reforms and everything. And that particular, you know, economic way in which society is organized, that has a way of changing the way we relate to each other and also to our cultural institutions. So yeah, it's not that we are, you know, like Denis makes the same argument. Like, it's not because, you know, human beings are naturally like this that, you know, liberalism, you know, presupposes that humans are your selfish, self-interested, only care about the enlargement of their own estates. But that's actually a creation that happens after liberalism is instituted. So I agree with that. But I'm saying the same thing that holds for, like, you know, liberal institutions also holds for free market economies. And the free market economy shapes us in accordance to its ideals. And that being the case, the people who are in charge of, you know, the capital, the corporations, the moneyed elite, they are the ones who have the power and steer the society. And whatever cultural stuff that happens is not unimportant, but it's second order. It's epiphenomenal. You know what I mean? It's not the primary driver. So if the United States is going left culturally, I don't consider that as much of a problem as the fact that it's extremely, you know, actually right wing in terms of its economic policy and standards.
Sure. So I guess let me start from the top there, because I think there's a lot of good things to talk about there. So James Burnham, which I think everybody who wants to get an understanding of kind of reactionary power analysis would do themselves a big favor in reading the Machiavellians. And in the Machiavellians, Burnham says that, you know, we have the iron law of oligarchy. Basically, we're always going to be ruled by an elite few. And it doesn't matter if you call those elite few communists, or if you call them capitalists, or if you call them, you know, a Catholic theocracy or a caliphate. It doesn't matter. There will always be the power in any country will always be held by an elite few, by an oligarchy. It's always going to be the case. And so if we're always going to be ruled, as you said, by those elites, then we want them to be held accountable. Like you said, we want them to, if we're always going to be led by elites, what we want them to do is have a reason to be interested in the well-being of the people they lead. We want them to have skin in the game, is a favorite phrase we have in reactionary circles. We want them to have skin in the game. We want to have an investment in the people. We don't want them operating the country as an apparatus for their advantage. We want it to be their advantage to make the country prosper and the people prosper. That's what we're looking for. And so I think maybe all we're really talking about is what's the best way to keep elites accountable. I don't think democratization is the best way to keep elites accountable, because I think democratization will always be controlled by the elites. I think that, as you know, you all you have to do is read your Noam Chomsky, right? Manufacturing consent. You can look at the Walter Lippmann book, Popular Opinion. Walter Lippmann was very much a liberal, a progressive, who was on board with the idea of manufacturing consent, and explained not only how it would be easy, but why it was necessary for a democratic process to do so. He said it is the duty of the elites to manufacture exactly the consent we're talking about. And so I don't think the democratization of the decision-making process actually creates an invested elite class. I think it allows the elites to turn the country in its direction. I think that's why we see this weird homogenization that we call neoliberalism, right? Because it's what you would call right-wing economics married with progressive social values, which creates this Frankenstein monster that we're both opposed to, despite being on different ends of the political spectrum. Because what happens is you get the worst of all worlds. You get a state that is dedicated to the destruction of identities that I think are essential to invest elites in the nations they run, and the creation of a culture that then makes basically the country into just consumers of the right-wing economics that you are opposed to. And so what we get is this woke capitalism phenomenon where Citibank is more than happy to acknowledge your trans identity on your your bank statement, but is also very happy to keep you in debt slavery for your entire life. And so I think while we both maybe have different ways we see that getting resolved, I think we're both two people noticing different parts of the elephant as opposed to talking about separate phenomenons.
I agree completely with that. With the last part, the first part is about democratization. We disagree, and I think you can look at the history of unions and when Americans had higher wages as an example of why either building counter institutions that hold at least in the check, or by democratizing the power apparatus, you can actually have a better result in terms of the economic status of the country. It was unions, an institution that was not held by government, a non-governmental institution that kind of really pushed the economic flourishing of the middle class and working class in this country. So that's one thing. Alternatively, why do you guys on the right consider the culture so much more important than the economic reality? That's really, because I think that is really where the difference lies, is that you guys see like the trans stuff, and look, whatever I'm not gonna make any statements about that type of thing, but we're looking at it like, okay, that's okay, do the trans stuff, but really like if you look at the institutional and structural aspects of the country, the corporate rich wins. It doesn't matter. I mean, that is the history of the country over the last 50 years. The corporate rich wins. Mm-hmm. So why is it that you want to look at it from a cultural vantage point, where if you look at it from the institutional vantage point, the winner is always the corporate rich? Why do you think the culture to be so much more important than the economic upheavals?
Because I think that the corporate victory that you're looking at is a function of the deterioration of culture. I think that you're right that I'm not opposed to unions. I think that they're perfectly reasonable. I have at times been, I guess, a free market libertarian. I am not now. That's not my economic position. And so I'm certainly not saying that they don't have a role to play in society, but I don't think unions in and of themselves are actually the primary defeater of corporate consolidation of power, if for only because wages aren't what threatens elite capitalism. What the wages are not what's putting an employer in controlling their power base. How did the middle class accumulate power? How do the kulaks get what they get, right? They get it through family structure. They get it by having tight-knit communities that build each other up. These tight-knit communities, these cultural communities, these family structures are what transmits wealth from generation to generation. And this is why it's basically the job of elites to make sure that the middle class never climbs, because that's what allows them to move to a higher class, right? So the culture being constructed and moved in a fashion which discourages family formation, which discourages religious and cultural identity, also has the benefit of deracinating the population. It makes sure that they become rootless economic units. And if your people, your consumers that you rule over, are deracinated, rootless cultural consumption units, they're never going to accumulate capital. They're never going to accumulate power, and you'll never have to respect their wishes. The cultural breakdown of identities that would guard people against the complete domination of the very corporations you're talking about are what our culture has been targeting. They have been wearing away any ability of the middle class to maintain the bonds that allowed them to achieve the economic success you're talking about. Marital stability, generational transfer of wealth inside families, religious and cultural communities that work with each other. These are the voluntary communal bonds that always kept a check on the elites, that always forced elites to actually have to respect the other classes in society. By encouraging the culture to destroy these things, we have encouraged the culture to break down all the barriers to exactly the thing you fear, which is the domination by these rich capital corporations of the people.
Okay, so this is an argument that's not only made by Deneen, but it's made by the Herzog and like the virtue of nationalism. It's a good book too. I think I recommended it to you. You should definitely check it out. It's the idea that family. He talks about family. He talks about tribe. He talks about how these are the basic building blocks of what he calls the philosophy of political order. So he says there's two ways of looking at politics. There's political philosophy, which takes it for granted that the state exists, and then there's the philosophy of political order, which looks at the presuppositions necessary for politics in the state to get off the ground at all. And he talks about the communal bonds of mutual loyalty, and these as being the ground for this actually to start happening. Now, that all may be true. I'm not that's a more it's an anthropological question about social psychology, maybe even evolutionary psychology, about what are the particular traits that humans display and need in order to build cohesive communities. And there's a little conflicting stuff about that, in some of the psychological literature about, homogenous societies, racially or what have you, and what that does for society cohesion. But the point that I'm getting to, you can have all that stuff. You can have all that cohesion if you don't have an institutional apparatus. So you can have, like, let's say we have strong families. We could have strong families tomorrow. And if they weren't able to find a mechanism of organization to combat the class dominance of the corporate and moneyed elite, it'd all be for nothing. Like, so there needs to be an institutional reality to push back against them. Unions are a manifestation of that. There can be other institutions also. Churches can do it, too. Mm-hmm. But there needs to be an institutional creation that fights against that and pushes against it. Unions were that. That is, like, if you look at the wage stagnation, it completely tracks with the decrease in union population. If you look at the Chamber of Commerce and some of these other, like, corporate boards that really determine policy, they fight against union policy. At Amazon, you can say whatever you want about, they'll treat you well. Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, everything. Mm-hmm. You talk about unionizing, you get fired. It doesn't matter then. So yes, like it may well be true that you need a certain degree of homogenous social structures. Homogenous cultural structures to get, to have the condition necessary for the institutional power, maybe, mm-hmm. But they don't necessarily lead to that. So it's not a necessary connection between that and institutional power on the one hand. And secondly, without the institutional power, it doesn't matter like how strong your culture is.
Well, I guess it just, yes, this is true. But I guess we're just going for chicken and the egg here then. Like, do you need the structure to pre-exist the culture? Does the culture need to pre-exist the structure? I think if we look, any historical analysis has to say the culture comes first. I think that the culture is what then gives rise to the apparatus, and that apparatus up until a couple hundred years ago was the state. States were largely cultural defense mechanisms to avoid what we're talking about here, right? They're cultural defense mechanisms that to defend, against outside interests to the people. That's not all they are, but it's certainly a primary function. And I guess at the end of the day, when we say we need a structural apparatus, a lot of reactionary power analysis is this: power is going to exist, and people are going to hold power. And there's, no matter what you try to do, you're never going to section power off from itself. Like that, this is, of course, one of the main critiques of the idea that America's division of power created a situation that would limit power, because it didn't. It just moved power somewhere else. So we can say that we want to move power to this structural apparatus that will defend the rights of the people and organize the people. But what's to keep the elites from infiltrating and using that, right? Like they are good at this. It's what they always do. It's why they are elites and why they stay in power largely. All these things that you're talking about to defend this interest are things that are going to get subverted in the interest of people who have the ability to lead and organize them, and which is why communism never works. And so I think that at the end of the day, again, rather than denying that we're always going to have these moneyed interests, that we're always going to have this elite class, I think the value is getting the elite class into a position where it has to respect the interest of the people it rules. And I think, again, we're both kind of saying that, because you were saying, look, we're going to have these people anyway. But you're just saying, we need to have this structure that controls them. And I agree, like we do. But I guess my answer to that is having them invested, because trying to generate any parallel power base politically will always just lead to, it's always just going to lead to civil war. Like, because the political realm is never going to allow two totally different parallel power structures. That is not the nature of politics. That is not the nature of power. Anyone who has power and sees someone else inside the same structure who also has power is planning to take their power. That's the nature of power. And so rather than thinking that separating this power creates the safeguard, which I don't think it does, I think the better thing is to figure out how to make sure that the power is vested in people who are interested in the continued betterance of the cultures and peoples over which they rule. But I guess, again, that's more of a, chicken or an egg, which one actually protects in the end is, I guess, what we're talking about there.
Yeah, so that's good. I understand where you're coming from there, but if you look empirically, it was the case that when America flourished, like I said, you can read Michael Lynn's book, The New Class War, where he talks about the tripart bargaining, where there were different, political interests, and the splitting of interests between the political realm and, certain non-political civic institutions like unions, but also, like I said, like churches, which stood as a counter to that. That is what allowed the flourishing that people always talk about in the 50s and 60s. That was the ground that allowed that. So the point of fact is, yes, when you do divide the power, it's better for the majority of the people. Now, you're right. There was a revolution by the upper class, by the money, the corporate elite, to put that down. But politics is not, we're not trying to say we're going to find a static, be at a static position. We're trying to work towards, different ways of organizing that could actually help the vast majority. Now, I'm going to go on to another question about, what is the program that reactionaries are trying to put in? Because I say some guys are Catholic, some guys are supposedly monarchists. Some guys are talking about, I don't know, Mulbug has this ridiculous corporate stuff. I mean, this is absolute. It's one of the more interesting aspects of his thought, but one of the most ridiculous. The idea that corporations, should can basically take control of the state. So what is it? You're talking about having the elites invested. What do you mean by that? I can point to a few different ways that we can do that. I pointed to unions, I pointed to churches, I pointed to other institutions that have in the past served as checks. What is the particular form of organization that you were talking about to get a leader invested? And since you consider cultural problems to be, at the root of the problem in America, you can explain to me a little bit more about like what do you see as the pernicious aspects of what you call a progressive to the left?
Yeah, so I think that, again, I really don't think we're that far off when we're talking about what's going to check or keep, I guess. I guess maybe the only difference is, rather than talking about checking the power of elites, I'm talking about guiding it in a direction that keeps them invested in the people and the well-being of the people that they're serving. I'm on board with churches and unions, I guess, and any other cultural institutions, making sure that elites have to have them on board in order to rule. Like I do think division of power, or rather than division of power, I guess I do believe that the power having to respect those institutions is extremely valuable. What made those institutions, though, so I think influential is not purely economics, because as you point out, it wasn't just the unions; it's also the churches, and the churches are, in addition to religion, functionally spokespeople in those times for their communities and the values of their communities and the values of their cultures. And so the reason that it's not just economic, I think it is cultural, is because those cultural institutions are key, right? Like you need a myriad of a network of those kinds of organic institutions that also inform the decisions of the elites, rather than just the economic ones. I'm not saying that the economic ones aren't important. I'm just saying I think you need more. I think it's the influences need to be beyond that. And if we only have a myopic vision of the powers being economic, it can be a distractor. I'm not saying you have that. I'm just saying that is a danger that we fall into. When you're talking about the solutions that neo-reaction, particularly, which is the school of reaction that tends to be informed by Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, I think you're right that the solutions are far worse than the power analysis. We always say the system analysis is great, the prescriptions are not so great, and so it's funny because in many ways what Yarvin suggests is a technocratic monarchy, basically. Basically just a rule by a tech CEO who will just consolidate power and then will be able to make the most efficient decisions. I don't believe in this. I find it ridiculous. I think it's but if you throw out every philosopher with bad ideas, then you wouldn't be reading Plato. So I think that you can't just look at one's work and say the solution, Plato's Republic is a nightmare, therefore his work is useless. And I think the same thing's true of Moldbug. I think that his work is extremely good when it comes to identifying power and the problems of liberalism, but I do think it falls down on the solution side. What would be my solutions? I would look for cultural autonomy. I would look for situations where we are building up a lot of the institutions you're talking about, parallel institutions that are going to provide many of the influences that you're talking about. I don't think I have a complete solution. I think Deneen ducks the same question at the end of why liberalism failed. I think largely because we have been in a liberal society for hundreds of years, and we have a hard time even imagining solutions that are outside of that. We've swam in that water for so long. Someone talking about monarchy looks like an insane person, right? We can't even think of politics outside of this democratic consensus ideal. But of course, that's not how politics work for the vast majority of history. There's no reason to believe it's the only reason it's going to work that way in perpetuity. I don't think it will. I think it will probably live its time and die like so many systems before it. But your last question was, why do I think that progressive cultural values are kind of a corrosive problem? I think was the last one.
Yeah, I was saying since we have a basic, we don't. I mean, our ideas aren't exactly the same, but we do have a similar, disagreement about not having a complete, disproportionate domination by corporate interests, right? So we have an agreement there.
Right.
I disagree about some more, nuanced stuff about how, the power apparatus works, which I don't. There's not enough evidence in the social science to suggest that the media and the academia are actually driving the cultural. It's not driving.
Do you mind if I stop you right there for just 1 second? I don't mean, but that phrasing, you got to think about what you just said. There's no evidence.
Yeah, I know, but you're going to say
in the social science,
right? You're going to say I'm begging the question, right? I know that. Yeah, I know. You're going to say, well, exactly. It wouldn't be because they're already dominant.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, but they let a lot of these guys are on the left, and leftists are just as much outside of the consensus in terms of economics as right-wing people are. So, and so far as like even from people who are also outside of the institutional apparatuses, there's not enough evidence for it. But you're right. There's no way. That's another problem I had about it when I was reading the ideas of the cathedral. In some sense, it's unfalsifiable, because if I offer you evidence or studies from within, the academy, you'll say, well, of course, it can't be, it can't be,
Well, right. No, it's fair, and I understand what you're saying, but the reason, so one of the problems that we have in our society is, of course, we can't trust institutions, and the reason that not being able to trust your institutions is a problem is that, for the large part, almost all discussions eventually break down to appeals of authority, right? Because none of us have, like, you can't do a bunch of sociological analysis and I can't do it either. Like, we don't have times. Like, I've got a family, I've got a job, I'm trying to run a YouTube channel. Like, I can't go out and run, these studies, and neither can you. So we have to rely on the expertise of others to draw conclusions, right? But the problem is, if the conclusions themselves are in error, or if they're being contested, then we lose a way to have discussions, because we can't reference these things, right? Because what happens is then we just end up selecting which institutions, because I can just point you to Robert Putnam and say, oh, well, Robert Putnam, who's not a right-winger, says that, diverse societies break down and it has serious problems and all these things. And you can say, well, actually, I've got a paper from, and like, we can just cite papers from people we like, but neither of us are going to have time to run these studies, and neither of us are going to have time to like do in-depth analysis, and even if we did, they would be very biased and very particular. And so this is in itself a problem, is if your institution, if your truth-making source is corrupt, or if it's being questioned, it becomes difficult to have these type of discussions, because then we don't have authorities to appeal to decide these issues, right? Like that. So I understand exactly what you're saying, but I don't see how you could ever question the validity of academia if we can't do that, right? Like if the only way to question academia is to cite academic sources, then that is an unfalsifiable claim on the other end.
Well, no, because this is very good. And I was hoping we get to this, because this is like one of the central, like, the central problems, I think, with the right in general, right? Mm-hmm. They think you can just, like, a lot of people on the far right, they think you can just like skip over the notice making, or the peer review, or just, you can't skip over that. So it might be the case that certain parts of the knowledge making apparatus, right, that certain parts of it are false, or completely false. That there are some parts of it that's not even science. There's a replication problem in some social and psychology, for example, right? So
massive. It's not a small one.
Yeah, no. I'm just using that as an example, right? There's a replication problem in psychology, for example, and so it might be a high degree of that is questionable, but at the same time, you're like, as a person on the right who's not within that context, you you kind of can't, you don't really know like what's going on to really get at the core issue. So it's an external critique for the most of the time. And like for example, I've been in grad schools and everything like that, and I've seen how the sausage is made a little bit, and it's not as pernicious as it's not, all of it isn't bad. So since some of it, you have to actually take your time to pick out the bad from the good, you can't necessarily like just wholesale like, all right, so it's we can just throw like 90% of this out or 80% of this out. It has to be like looked at piece by piece, right? So because of that, there's no way, like if somebody has already had some investment in academia or they're in academia and they read the papers and all of that, what Moldbug is offering, if you're inside of it, it can't convince somebody to come out of it. You know what I mean? It's not like the critique is not strong enough to convince the people it needs to convince.
Well, I guess the question is, does it need to be? Because yeah, you're right. Like if you're invested in that, if you're invested in the peer review process and you truly believe that it is unbiased, or it's either unbiased or leads to unbiased outcomes on the whole, then you're right. Like I don't see a lot of people stepping outside of that, but I don't think institutional capture is an argument against institutional capture, right? Like I came from the media. Most people I worked with didn't think of themselves as biased. And they were insanely biased to anyone who was not educated in a progressive journalism school. Like if you're in that environment for 10 minutes and you didn't come steeped in the preconceived notions that dominate the field, then it's very easy for you to understand the bias. Like it is blatant, it's repeated often, it's enforced at every level. But every one of those journalists would tell you that, I mean, I know my colleagues lean left, but is the media really left wing? I mean, that would be the refrain of every one of them. And honestly, I don't think academia has a better answer to that problem. Will all critiques outside of academia necessarily be insufficiently informed for people inside academia? Yes. Absolutely. But I don't think that's a better argument than saying, people inside the Catholic Church would have a hard time seeing their own bias towards Catholicism. Like it's just a true function of people inside a worldview. I don't see why academia's worldview is any more protected from this idea. Peer review is simply a system in which you make sure that the people around you agree with you on most of these things. I know that's not how it functions.
Now, come on now.
I know that's not how it functions inside each research paper, but that is the consistent move. That is how it moves things in a particular direction.
Okay, so that's good. So there are two things to say about that. On the one hand, yeah, like the fact that an external critique is not going to move academics is not proof that the critique is wrong. So that's right. On the other hand, it doesn't prove it's right. And on the third hand, if you're trying to challenge this apparatus and get, because you say this if the proposition is that the tastemakers and this knowledge making apparatus is what pushes society, then you got to have some arguments that can convince the people in that apparatus to change their minds or think differently. Otherwise, you're not going to gain power. So
sure.
Right. So on the one hand, like politically, it's in you have to do it. And in terms of theoretically, an external critique doesn't necessarily make something right either. So so epistemically, there's that problem.
Sure. So I guess here's the question. And I'm not Catholic, but many people in the reactionary sphere are. Let's put it this way: is the Catholic Church more powerful or less powerful now than it was in the 1400s? Right? I think anyone objectively is going to say it's less powerful. Did the Catholic Church become less powerful because someone convinced the Pope that Catholicism was wrong? No, right? Like that's not how Catholicism became less powerful. What happened was parallel institutions became more powerful and reduced the power and influence of the church, right? So when I say academia, we're going to have to, scale back its power. I that is correct, but I'm not saying we do that by like capturing academia. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think you win. I don't think you win that battle by converting professors to, crazy, Mencius Moldbug takes, edgy reactionary takes. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think what happens is that the power of the institution wanes, the same way the power of all corrupt institutions wane by interfacing poorly with reality and being sclerotic, right? Like the academic, what's going to make academia fail is going to be its hubris. It's going to be its hegemony over its control is almost total, and it's going to get fat and lazy, and it's going to produce lower quality individuals, and it's going to have lower quality individuals in charge, and the wheels are going to fall off. I think you're already seeing that. I think that's why it's radicalizing, because the inmates are running the asylum in a lot of academia now, because it's drank its own Kool-Aid. And so I don't think that reactionaries are going to infiltrate. We call this entryism, right? And I don't think entryism works. Like, I don't think we're going to see a bunch of like reactionaries enter into academia and make powerful arguments that change people's minds, and then they'll be on side, because that's literally what reactionaries say doesn't work. That's our critique, is that it doesn't work. Like, you don't win these things by convincing people. It's not a democratic process. It's a process of taking and holding the power in these areas. I don't think that the Catholic Church loses its power because a lot of people convince the Pope not to be Catholic. Though I guess some people argue against that now. But I think it loses its power because. But I think.
Well, look, yeah.
But you understand what I'm saying. Like, I don't think that the church lost its power because it decided to not be the church anymore. I think it lost its power because other institutions became more powerful and it became less powerful. The same is going to be true of academia. It's not going to lose its power because I convince a bunch of people, or Mencius Moldbug convince a bunch of people in academia to stop believing in it. It's going to lose its power because another institution rises parallel to it that has a similar function, but has an entire different basis for its ideology that it espouses.
Right. So, and I've heard this argument before, and I was going to actually, make that same statement about the need to build parallel institutions. But the problem with that is, like there's this, and this is an idea that's, on the far left and the far right you get that things are just unsustainable and that things will collapse on itself, and et cetera. Now, in the long run, everything collapses. We are animals in a world of entropy, and it is. We read the classical Christian theologians. Everything participates in nothingness. Every created being, has nothingness within it. It is drawn towards destruction. Right. So that's fine. That's all. Mm-hmm. But you got to deal with the problem of the time frame of this, and whether this is actually going to whether the destruction of these institutions is actually going to create anything better. So these instances, like you say, academia might collapse in some sense. It might collapse in some sense, but it just might be like the woke might just completely reign over the earth. It just could be a collapse of the liberal aspects of the academia of its objective function, and it could just become more partisan and still as powerful and still rule. So there's no like set logic, ingrained in things. Like people on the left say capitalism would just, collapse under its own, internal logic. No, it won't. The neoliberalism got some time to go. It could go for a long time. It can keep going. It can keep going. The academy can keep going. All this stuff could keep pressuring on. So there's nothing like you have to look. If you look at like the structure of it, the structure of the dominance of global finance, the structure of what academia. I mean, academia is a different beast, but the structure of global finance, for example, like these things could like keep on going for a long time, and I don't see any reason to think that from the evidence that we have now, that something strong enough, a new institution that can serve as a knowledge base, of a society can come on that's different from the academy, when the academy has been that for almost since the University of Paris, 700, 800 years. So like in any really short period of time for such a transition to take place, and also for this transition to be something that would actually be beneficial to reactionaries. So I don't see any reason to think that would happen.
Sure, and that's a common criticism, and I think a fair one. Like I think one of the things about Moldbug's work is the magic factor is always societal collapse, which is something you really don't want to bet on. He just says, well, eventually, like basically just this progressivism will fail, and when it fails, then we'll just kind of move in because everyone will see the failure and they'll want something different. So I agree that you can't just bet on that. That said, I think that there is a natural entropy to institutions. I think that it's hard for us to imagine anything else taking the place of academia because it's all we ever known. But tell someone in the 1600s that the West wouldn't be predominantly Christian, right? Like, could they even imagine that? Tell somebody in the 1200s that the West wouldn't be predominantly Catholic, right? Is that even a reality that's available to them, right? I don't think it is. So just because we can't imagine it doesn't mean that it won't occur, and doesn't mean that it doesn't naturally occur. I think it does. Like, humans can't predict the future is nothing new, right? So then it becomes a practical question. So what can we do? What can we organize? Well, the problem is that sitting power wants to stay in power, right? So I think we do need parallel institutions, but I think the minute that parallel institutions directly threaten the power of people who have like the largest military in the world, they're probably just going to crush it, right? Like, and we don't, and it doesn't even need to. That's the best part. Like, you look at the woke capitalism stuff, and look at what they're doing, right? They pull the accounts of all these like ethno-nationalist groups, or these different groups on the right, and they just go in and they shut down their bank accounts. They're not shutting down the bank accounts of like communists, right? They're shutting down these people's bank accounts, and they're doing that because they don't want them to organize, right? And I think that you're going to continue to see that, and then the question is, what kind of institutions get built when you're, at any point your bank can just close all your accounts and make you unemployable and basically functionally turn you into a non-person? Like, if unions are really a challenge to their power, and Citibank can already do that to an individual, what makes you think they can't do that to someone leading a union? What makes you think they can't do that to leading anything, right? And so what we have to do is build institutions that don't directly, at least initially, present that kind of challenge, because those in charge have a very easy way of shutting that kind of stuff down quickly and cleanly, right? And they started on guys like Alex Jones, right? Like, Alex Jones is out there screaming about the frogs getting turned gay, and they censor him, and everyone says, okay, well, he's a nut bar. But then they take guys like Stefan Molyneux out, and then they start taking down stuff, and now to the point where Twitter and Facebook won't run stories from the New York Post, which is a paper that was founded by Alexander Hamilton. Now, you can argue about the validity of the story, but the point is that these tech...
I didn't see that. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they won't run the Hunter Biden story. The Hunter Biden.
Well, yeah, so I saw that. Yeah,
So whether you agree with the Hunter Biden story or not is immaterial. The point is, tech oligarchs can push a button, and major journalistic outlets functionally can no longer spread things across the internet. And so if when we talk about opposition, you can say, well, I don't think we're going to see someone come in and like challenge these things directly. And I think you're right. I think the institutional power will always make that impossible. So the best thing we can do is start building these small parallel institutions that can grow organically. And if they generate enough organic interest, then they have a possibility of actually getting picked up by elites who are dissatisfied with the current scenario that can shelter them. But I don't think you're ever going to see popular revolutions are a myth, right? Like, they just don't happen. What happens is one group of elites picks up the cause of a people who have been disenfranchised, and they, yes, exactly, exactly, and they are the ones that end up ushering in a new leadership role. They're the ones who end up taking these institutions that have been built parallel and installing them into power. It never just happens that like a bunch of workers get together and overthrow the Pinkertons, right? Like that's not real. Like that's not a thing that actually happens.
Well, no, even the civil rights movement was founded by, it was backed by the Ford Foundation. I mean, everybody who people need to read more, but I mean, but you look at I'm sorry. I mean, I'm going to sound like a pretentious idiot, but I'm sorry, but yeah, some of this stuff is like, this is well-known stuff if you look over the archives. Even Malcolm X criticized the fact that King was getting funded by some corporate guys. They wouldn't fund him because he was a little too far. Malcolm X couldn't get the funding.
Right. And there's a reason that every kid, there's a street named after Martin Luther King in every town, and every kid knows his name and goes to MLK High School, and they don't know who Malcolm X is, and so it's not an accident, that it's on purpose, right? And I think that's always going to be the case, right? So you're right to critique a reactionary approach that simply says like society collapse and then we get into power. I don't think that's what happens. This is where I think things fall down for like Moldbug and some other people who suggest this. But I do think they have a point in like the cathedral is not directly assailable. Like whether you want to call it the cathedral or you want to call it, corporate elites, whatever you want to call it, like these people are not directly assailable, right? Like Jeff Bezos is not going to fall out of power next week because a labor union gets started, right? Like neither of these things are going to crumble in the face of small amounts of popular opposition. And so what we need to do is we need to build these movements parallel. That's why I think the cultural issue is so important, because I think without an institutions inside those cultures that build organic unity within people, then I don't think you're going to see organized opposition that allows alternative elites to come to power and be interested in the concerns and lives of the people they actually govern. I think as long as we are divided in the way that our current culture requires us to be divided, we will never be able to build opposition that can then be picked up and installed by a new set of elites that will be interested in protecting and serving the people that they rule over.
Good. So I want to segue this into a few more questions, some final questions. I don't want to hold you too long. I don't know if you're enjoying the conversation or not, but yeah. On the one hand, what are the main? So yeah. So I see that you really you're focused on the cultural issues, and I kind of gave my spiel about what I think are the dominant financial interests that are controlling and really hindering any type of movement towards a more democratized or a more balanced situation in terms of power. What are the cultural impediments? Because I know this is what you guys growing on about. So what are the cultural impediments to the project that you're trying to establish, and basically just what are the biggest issues, the biggest impediments to establishing what you are looking to do?
Sure. So I am actually absolutely enjoying the conversation, but yeah, I do probably have to go in about 5-10 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to do this justice. Sorry, I don't mean to cut out on you, but I do have another commitment. But if I was to sum it up, I would say that basically like the way in which our current culture is disincentivizing family formation is probably my core concern. I would say that is the fundamental problem that we are facing. I think it's what keeps us from building a middle class. I think it's what keeps us from accumulating political capital in that middle class. I think it's what keeps the elites from having to care about the majority of the people involved. I think and of course I think it is just the spiritual is a problem of the spiritual health of the country. And I think the spiritual health of the people is it's inseparable from the economic issue, and I don't really see how you can move those. And there are many factors that keep us from doing this. I mean, one of them is, of course, our current credentialist system, right? Like, you are required to, for the same job that someone of my father's generation could get, like a store manager, you are required to have a 4-year degree. My dad is not, my dad was a lawyer. He's not a store manager, but my grandfather worked at, Caterpillar. He was a mechanic for Caterpillar, and he was able to raise a family on that income, right? And that's just not something that's available. And he didn't go to college for that. And the idea that you could raise a family of 5 on the income of a construction equipment mechanic is insane now, right? Like, that's just not something that's available. And many of those positions, even for income that could not support a family, requires you to go to college for 4 years to do the same job someone without a college degree did beforehand, which means you're often not only spending 4 years of key earning potential and key time building, where you're often starting a family, instead of spending that during that time, you're spending it at a college, not only not making money, but functionally entering debt slavery. You're going $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in debt to get a degree to make what is functionally less than what your grandfather could have made for the same job. Now, not only is that setting you behind the 8 ball in building wealth and starting a family, you probably spent what you would have spent on the down payment for a home at that point. So now, not only have you not started a family, not only have you gone into debt to acquire the same level of income that your grandfather did, you're also now not owning a home. And what is the main transfer of wealth inside the middle class? It's home ownership, right? That's where we saw the explosion of affluence inside the American middle class, right? That was a main transference vehicle. Was they bought a bunch of real estate and it all went up in value. And so the fact that just these very basic things that help us to build families are being opposed, that would be the economic side, right? That would be how the economic structure of our society is opposing those. But I don't think it's just the economic structure. I think it's also the cultural structure, where we're encouraged to not be religious. Religion is one of the key factors on whether or not you get married and have children. Religious people get married and have families. Irreligious people are far less likely to do so. So secularism also, obviously reduces the likelihood of family formation. The sexual revolution, people are far less likely to have happy, long-lasting relationships as they extend their number of partners. And our attitudes towards that, the transience of that interaction, is going to inherently reduce the long-term success of families. And of course, as families break down, they then lose their economic power, right? When families divorce, when women have children out of wedlock, it increases their likelihood that they will never obtain middle class status. And so again, like, I just think that the encouraged and even oftentimes subsidized engagement in these kind of cultural activities then creates the economic realities and then the political realities that we're seeing. I think it's all downstream from the way in which we are organizing our society culturally.
That's very good. I think there's some truth in a lot of that. Not only there, especially with the university. I mean, like I said, I'm probably going to be in the belly of the beast. In terms of academia. So that's there's a lot to be said about that, but I can't go into that too much.
No, I understand.
I don't. So I can't. But I do think the family formation and the fact that the degrees have become really deflated in terms of their value. I mean, if everybody getting a college degree, what is it worth? Now, grad school really is the necessary step up now. Everybody who's really trying to be ambitious, they have not only to get a college degree, many of them are getting grad school degrees, so that delays you another 2 to 5 years, and you have to spend more money. I mean, it's becoming an even more fiercer, competition for credentials, and that's a huge problem. especially with the cost. So there's a lot of problems. And then there's the rise of adjunct professors. So I think the structure of academia definitely has a lot of problems with it. In terms of like the family stuff, this is where the left, this is where there's a big division on the left, the sexual stuff. And, this is where I'm a little bit heterodox, in my views insofar as I think there's a lot of, I'll say there's something to be said about what you said. Not I wouldn't agree with everything of it, but there's a lot to be said for it. Even though I can't, I think there's, people should have the right to have a, freedom of choice in terms of their sexual practices, but those practices can be self-destructive. They can be self-destructive and they can be destructive to communities. As far as secularism is concerned, that's a deeper problem, man. That the problem is, that there's a lot of evidence that the actual, truth of religion is a question that, people really don't have control over whether they want to believe it or not. There's a lot of like countervening evidence, and there's been a proliferation of some of the classical arguments against it. There's been all this, have you read Charles Taylor's The Secular Age? I recommend that. That's an incredible book on this whole topic. The best book on the topic that I've come across. And A Secular Age by the philosopher Charles Taylor, Canadian. You love him. I'm telling you, he'd be your guy. Look into that book. He was influenced by MacIntyre, I believe, also. So look.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, look into him. A Secular Age. So a lot of this stuff, the historical biblical criticism, which was developed in Germany. A lot of these arguments have drifted down to people who are not, as sophisticated, but they take it in anyway. And now, atheism is just like, an easy position for somebody who's not aligned with religion as a whole. Now, I'm not an atheist. I don't believe in traditional, I'm not adherent to any traditional religion, but I'm not an atheist. But, it's an easy path to take for somebody who's like, kind of smart, a little bit above educated, but hasn't really done a lot of deep study. So, that's like the perfect zone for like easy atheism. I'm not talking about like, you can be an atheist and be intelligent, but there's an easy atheism that comes from like just having enough knowledge,
Oh, sure, because it's the cultural consensus, right? Like that's what makes it, just like, Christianity would have been the easy settling point for someone a few hundred years ago. And yeah, we could do 9 hours on the truth of religion and all that. That's obviously not why we got together on this one. But when I say secularity, I really do mean just that approach, right? Like I'm not saying I obviously I'm a Christian, and I think it's true, and I think there's a lot of good reasons to believe it's true, and I think that it's really a foundational thing to understand the world. But other religions had pieces of this truth, right? And like I don't think it has to be. I don't think that when I say secularity, I really do just mean the absence of any form of traditional religion. But of course, secularity is itself a religious and Christian notion, which is a point that Tom Holland makes in his book Dominion. It's a historian who writes, and is a guy who's kind of approached his liberal secularism and said, I didn't think about it as a religious assumption, but of course that's exactly what it was when I started looking at it, and I can't divorce any of those conclusions from anything in the same way that a Christian couldn't. But yeah, I think that the important thing with conversations like this, like we're having, like you said, is we can go into those differences, and they're important. Don't get me wrong; they're fundamental. But I think if we have more dialogues like this, where people from both sides who do see problems with modernity, do see this kind of problems with the mainstream political consensus, and can come around and talk about, like, look, whether you think it's this direction or that direction, family formation is essential, right? Like, if that's something that we can agree on, then that's something that can actually create a political coalition, or at the very least create a scenario where there's an understanding that can be moved to something, I think, more productive. And so I think that while we're gonna differ on emphasis and differ on some of our solutions or some of our definitions or explanations, I think just coming to a consensus of, hey, whether you think it's A or B, we can both agree that, like, massive corporations don't have your interest at heart right now, and politicians are operating in a sphere that isn't going to change that, and like there are societal issues that need to be fundamentally looked at if we're going to see that changed. I think just saying that is a big step for most people, because it breaks them out of this red state, blue state mindset of, well, if I'm not looking across the aisle and assuming that the person across from me hates me and wants me destroyed, then I'm just never going to change anything. I think that's not really productive at the moment. I think I'm not saying there aren't real divisions in the country, and there aren't divisions from left and right. I think they are, and I think they're fundamental, but I think that they're far more complex. And the ones we're focused on right now are the ones that we've been fed by kind of media and standard political apparatus. And doing this kind of thing can help us to break out of that mindset and look at the things that actually matter, and maybe actually put our camps in different places rather than just, knocking down MSNBC or Fox News talking points.
Yeah, the boomer conservative, and the wine mom neo-lib, they're a plague. But I definitely agree with that, and I'm glad that you stopped by. I think this was a very productive conversation. There needs to be more of these type of things. I don't think the silos that people have on YouTube and in general, especially among people who are anti-establishment. I think that there can be an anti-establishment consensus on some things, an overlap on these issues, and I think if we really want to push, because the country is at a point where it is, really experiencing some harsh divisions, and I think for all of us who have to share the same country, we should try to focus on some of the things that are really of crucial importance that we can agree on, and try to move from there. Even though we're not going to agree on everything, but the points that are crucial and of importance. I think a lot of times what we do agree on is enough to really establish like some kind of program for work to be done in the future.
Yeah, just the conversation is enough, man, and I really appreciate you having me on.
Good. Have a great one, man.
You too.